healthy dose of persistence and a whole lot of audacity, because it takes a while to build these things. But the payoff is huge, as I mentioned earlier.
Yeah. And in terms of these guys, and you called them like, just low-level knuckleheads, essentially. These are criminal organizations doing these things, not sophisticated. Some people, of course, portray them as like, oh, they're bringing, people here to find, hope and whatever else. Are these guys just like hardened criminals you're dealing with? What are the types you deal with when you have found the ones doing these tunnels?
Well, the people building the tunnels in there, yes, they are criminals. Of course they are. They're in it. They work for an illicit organization in there whose sole purpose in there is to import poison into our country. Yes, that makes them a whole level of scum in anybody's estimation.
And it's a big challenge to federal authority over immigration, which could lead to a fight in the U.S. Supreme Court. Abbott's program also supports constructing barriers near the border. The Texas House also approved an additional $1.5 billion for that effort. The new law will go back to the state Senate and then head to Abbott's desk for his signature. Much of the attention in the 2024 race has been on the presidential candidates. So how important are state and local elections? Joining us now is an award-winning journalist who explains how state elections can nullify tyranny at the state line. Alex Newman, thank you so much for joining us. Great to be back on the show.
Great to be here. Thank you so much.
Alex, to begin, the 2024 election cycle is ramping up. There's a lot of focus on the presidential election, but what about the state and local elections? What's the importance there?
Yeah, I would argue that state and local elections are almost as important as the presidential election, because really the vast majority of the laws and the policies that are going to affect you on a day-to-day basis in terms of your family, your property, your business, these are coming from the state and local level. I don't want to downplay the importance of the presidential election, but the reality is most of us are not going to affect the presidential election. Even if we're influential and we can influence hundreds or thousands of people, the reality is that changing the outcome there is very difficult. But at the local level, that's not true. And as we saw during the pandemic, here in my state of Florida, our state, our local, and our county governments, in many cases, actively protected the freedoms of the people in our communities, whereas the federal government was pestering them to adopt these policies. So it can have a huge, huge impact, and it can make a huge difference in the preservation of your freedom and your rights and all the rest of it. So I do encourage people to really pay attention to what's happening at the local and the state level. It's just as important, if not more.
And Alex, I want to zoom in on that. You used that example of Florida and the pandemic in your article titled State Elections Nullifying Tyranny at the State Line. How does that fit in with the message from the Founding Fathers?
Well, the Founding Fathers, and unfortunately this has been lost to history. Very few Americans even know this. They don't read these documents anymore. But the Founding Fathers viewed what's called nullification, or the doctrine of interposition, as, to quote Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, the father of our Constitution, the rightful remedy for dealing with federal usurpations of power. So a quick constitutional lesson: the states and the people came together. They created the federal government through the Constitution. The Constitution authorizes the federal government to exist. It also lists the powers that the federal government has been given by the states and by the people, who ultimately retained ultimate sovereignty. Now, that list is mostly outlined in Article 1, Section 8. You can run a post office, you can have a navy, you can declare war. So they have some significant powers. But everything else was reserved to the states or to the people, as they actually said explicitly in the 10th Amendment. And so when the federal government goes beyond the powers that have been delegated to it, Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, Thomas Jefferson was the key author of the Declaration of Independence, James Madison, the key author of the Constitution. They both said the correct response here, the rightful remedy, is for state governments to say, no, that's not going to happen. And they actually put that into practice. So the very first time we had this in our country, shortly after the Constitution was adopted, Congress passed the Alien and Sedition Acts. These were obviously unconstitutional. They purported to regulate speech and things like this. Well, Thomas Jefferson and James Madison wrote the Virginia and the Kentucky resolutions. I encourage folks to read them, because what they essentially said is that here in Virginia, here in Kentucky, we are not going to obey those unconstitutional laws. In fact, we're going to protect our citizens from this usurpation of power. Very effective. This was used during the Civil War with slavery to protect individuals who ran away from slavery in the northern states. Has a long history in our country, and unfortunately, very few Americans know this history.
And it seems it's not just our own federal government. You also note the United Nations and the World Health Organization. How could these institutions influence the American way of life if states don't push back?
Yeah, and what's really encouraging to me is the states are pushing back, right? So the UN, of course, this happens with all governments, it always wants to accumulate more and more power. And so we shouldn't be surprised to see the global bureaucrats at the UN, the global bureaucrats at the World Health Organization trying to usurp more and more power. This is just natural. It's what governments and what would-be governments around the world and throughout history have done. And yet, very thankfully, here in our states, we have a lot of significant efforts to push back. About a decade ago, the state of Alabama, to give you one clear example, unanimously, every Republican, every Democrat in the House and Senate in the state of Alabama passed a nullification measure declaring that Agenda 21, the UN's agenda for the 21st century, was null and void within Alabama. They prohibited any state or local or county government agency or employee from participating in the enforcement or the imposition of this Agenda 21. And again, this passed unanimously. 100% support in the legislature. Right now, the contemporary context, we have the World Health Organization right now trying to usurp vast new powers over our lives, over our health care, over our companies. And one individual that I spoke with on this topic, Representative Josiah Magnuson, he's got a bill in the South Carolina legislature that would nullify the World Health Organization's power grabs. It would declare that no agency, no employee, no resource of the state or any subdivision thereof can participate in the enforcement of any mandate, directive, recommendation coming out of the World Health Organization. This is something that states all across the country can do. It's something that I believe and the Founding Fathers would have said they should do, and it's a very effective way of putting the federal government back in its constitutional box without even having to go through the process of a federal election or switching out power in Congress or at the executive branch.
And
That was the thousands.
Oh, yeah.
Run it once, and I understand Border Patrol. I mean, they could not do anything for their, and not because they're outnumbered, but because of their own safety. You know, you're outnumbered 1,000 to 1. Not much you can do. I mean, in terms of how things turned around with the wall in San Diego sector, do you talk about this? I know the wall here is really the model for what's being done across the whole country right now, the whole border at least.
Most of it, yeah. Well, they're trying to.
So, how would you say the effect was of the border wall when it was built?
Not much. As far as tunnels, I can't see much. I know there's another party line for this one as well, and it's right. I just don't know if I can get it right in there. This is what I will say definitively. So, tunnels of this variety and deeper ones, a little more extravagant ones, which is not much more extravagant, but storm drain. The principle's the same. They existed long before there was even a wall here. Okay. As little as 20 years ago, there was just a single cable basically delineating Mexico from the United States. That's all that separated us. They were still tunneling back then, okay? Tunnels serve a certain purpose in that it's able to move a large amount of product north in secret in relatively short order. If you try to do that more conventional means, whether it's through mules and backpack or through the ports of entry, in a truckload or something like that, it takes constant, efforts and multiple visits to do that, all decreasing your probability for getting that much through, right? Mm-hmm. So tunnels, even maritime stuff is the same manner, right? You can get a lot of it north in relative short order. Mm. And the payoff is astronomical. So it makes sense from that very crude way of looking at things.
And I assume they just keep every channel they can open. They exploit every channel they can. Right?
Sure. It's a business just like everything else. Just happens to be.
It will be an issue to unite his party and work across the aisle on this aid.
Well, Iris, the issue for Johnson here is sort of twofold. Like you mentioned, his position where he stands on this issue is that actually we know from his previous voting record that he's against Ukraine aid, and now this poses an issue, and now he has to actually work across the aisle to not only provide aid to Israel, but also to Ukraine. The other aspect of this issue for Johnson and the pressure that he's facing with his negotiations with the White House and with the Senate is the fact that the White House has requested $106 billion to combine both Israel and Ukraine aid together in one package, which some Republican members in Congress have an issue with. We'll show you what those members had to tell us about this combination in this legislation. Take a look.
What's the president's view on how long we're going to be doing this? This funding will get us close to $200 billion. How are we going to pay for it?
That's fine. It's no problem. We have to help both. These are regional wars that we got to help. Otherwise, it can become a bigger conflict.
We have to stand shoulder to shoulder with Ukraine. There needs to be a level of scrutiny and an assertion that we have a common goal.
Israel aid is immediate. Ukraine received already a lot of funding. We need to take care of Israel, and we have American hostages. We have Americans who were killed.
So this likely took up a large portion of the discussion that Johnson and the president, along with Johnson's counterpart, Hakeem Jeffries, the leader of the Democratic Party, this probably took up the largest part of the discussion that they talked about today. And so Johnson now is really in the ring of fire, so to speak. This is his first day on the job, and he's already having to kind of go against some of his core values just to be able to work across the aisle, which in this position, Iris, he inevitably has to do.
There's truly some different viewpoints in Congress on Israel. We saw that yesterday when 9 Democrats refused to condemn Hamas's attacks, and now there is a possible censure resolution against one of those anti-Israel members. So, Melina, tell us more about this censure resolution going on here.
So this censure resolution is against Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib. It was introduced just this afternoon by Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene. Remember, Democrats actually previously kicked Marjorie Taylor Greene off of her committees during the last Congress for what they call her spreading conspiracy theories. Now Congresswoman Greene is going back and providing the censure resolution against Tlaib for she essentially accuses her of sympathizing with the Hamas terrorist group, and also, interestingly enough, she accuses Tlaib of inciting an insurrection in the Capitol, because last week there was that protest that had hundreds of people come both inside the walls of Congress and outside. Rashida Tlaib was speaking to protesters outside the halls of Congress. We'll show you what Greene had to say when she introduced this censure resolution today, as well as a Jewish Democrat that says she opposes this resolution.
A resolution censuring Representative Rashida Tlaib for anti-Semitic activity, sympathizing with terrorist organizations, and leading an insurrection at the United States Capitol complex. Whereas in May 2019, Rashida Tlaib said that she celebrated the Holocaust and felt a calming feeling when thinking about the genocide of millions of Jews.
Rich for her to be looking to censure Rashida Tlaib. Look, do I agree with everything Rashida says? No, but she's not inciting violence. And that is what the conversation was around Ms. Greene.
But we do know of at least one Democrat that said he would consider passing the censure resolution if it does come to the floor for a vote. That's Congressman Jared Moskowitz. So it will be interesting to see how Democrats vote on this if it does, in fact, come to the floor, which right now is up to Speaker Johnson. We'll see whether or not he plans to bring this up to the floor, and we're hearing that it could take place sometime next week. Iris?
Thank you, Melina. As Speaker Mike Johnson now takes over the gavel, what does his experience mean for the future of the GOP conference? We talked with Republican Congressman Josh Burkeen of Oklahoma about Speaker Johnson and the situation unfolding in the Middle East. Congressman Josh Burkeen, thanks so much for joining us.
You bet. Happy to be with you.
So first, on now Speaker Johnson, you know him as a colleague and voted for him. So based on your understanding and your interactions with him, how might his background as a former constitutional lawyer who worked on religious freedom issues guide him and influence him as the Speaker of the House and also the leader of the Republican House Conference going forward?
Look, I think Mike Johnson is the right man for the time. And I'm looking at a nation that's exhibiting moral rot. And to have someone that it would, innate to who they are, that understands founding principles, adherence to biblical morality, adherence to constitutional intent, what our founding fathers set forth as limited principles. I'm excited about the things that Mike Johnson is going to do to hopefully reset us on the things I just espoused. There's authentic enthusiasm in support of Mike Johnson because of his reputation for having a deep rudder.
And on the GOP conference as a whole, the White House has been criticizing this whole process as chaos. And 22 days without a speaker is a long time, especially at a critical moment like this. So how do you convince the American public that Republicans suffer no harm in their ability to deliver, which is what you said yesterday?
No, I love that. That suffer no harm comes from a friend of mine who was actually referencing a New Testament scripture. And sometimes when you can get involved in things that are harmful and you can walk away, shake it off, and suffer no ill effect. And I believe that's what's going to happen to this Republican conference. I believe out of our mess will be a ministry, out of the pain will be gain, out of the test that we've gone through, there's going to be a great testimony that the grassroots is going to be invigorated and see those bold colors, not pale pastel, that's been the result of this fire we've been through in the last 3 weeks.
And now moving on to the Middle East, we heard that the U.S. government is sending more troops to the Middle East in preparation for anything that could go wrong, or this conflict could widen, given the attacks on U.S. forces right now in the Middle East. So what do we know about the threats at this moment? What should we be focused on in the U.S.?
So I'm glad you asked that. Americans need to pay attention that Iran wants to do us harm, and they are convinced that they might not be able to take us on from the outside, but they may be trying to take us on from within. We have a plot that was uncovered coming across the southern border, that there was a plot from ISIS to take out former President Bush. We have a plot that was been uncovered that is specific to the Islamic Revolutionary Guard that was going after Bolton and Mike Pompeo. Trying to these international actors trying to target key individuals within the U.S. government, former officials. You have a lady that testified before the Homeland Security Committee yesterday. I had a great honor to ask her questions. She's a former Iran journalist who lives in America now, and she was an assassination on her life occurred in New York in the last couple of years, with some man showing up with an AK-47 because of his ties to the Revolutionary Guard of Iran, because she was telling the truth about the Iranian regime. There was also another plot to kidnap her out of Brooklyn, put her on a ship, and take her back to Iran. She had a colleague when she was a journalist that was actually, this was done to in France, taken back to Iran, and was executed. We know there's a list called the Special Interest Alien List. There's been 639 people that have come across that southern border that are on the Special Interest Alien List that are coming from Iran. And we've had 1.5 million gotaways that have come across our southern border. We don't know how many more. And so, look, we have to be vigilant. It's for our water treatment centers. It's for our electric grid. It's for key officials that their families could be in jeopardy. People could be blackmailed. Iran looks and calls Israel, the little Satan, and they call us the great Satan. And we need to be vigilant because they are trying to get within the interior of the United States and do this country harm.
Congressman Josh Burkeen, thanks so much for joining us.
Hey, God bless you. Thanks for having me on, Iris.
Almost 24 hours after a shooting in Maine, the suspect is still at large. At least 18 people are confirmed dead. The White House now speaking out about the shooting and asking the newly elected House Speaker for support.
The House has a new Speaker who he said he's ready to get to work and to find common ground. Now is the time. Now is the time to find common ground. Let's work together to ban assault weapons and high-capacity magazines.
Newly elected Speaker Mike Johnson says this is a dark time for America. He's calling for prayers so that the evil can end. The White House says President Biden's pledging full support to communities in Maine. It all comes after a gunman last night opened fire at a bowling alley and a restaurant in the town of Lewiston. At least 18 people are dead and 13 more are wounded. The suspect, who the police are calling armed and dangerous, is still on the run. With the gunman still on the loose, what are the police officers doing to catch him? And how might this reported history of mental illness relate to the shooting? Joining us to discuss is Betsy Brandner-Smith, a retired police sergeant and spokesperson for the National Police Association. Sergeant Betsy Brandner-Smith, thanks so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
About the manhunt that started after this shooting, you are an expert in police investigations. Tell us about what kind of process are we looking at here? What steps are usually involved based on what you are observing about this case?
Well, this was such an extraordinary event because leading an insurrection at the United States Capitol complex. Whereas in May 2019, Rashida Tlaib said that she celebrated the Holocaust and felt a calming feeling when thinking about the genocide of millions of Jews.
Rich for her to be looking to censure Rashida Tlaib. Look, do I agree with everything Rashida says? No, but she's not inciting violence. And that is what the conversation was around Ms. Green.
And we know of at least one Democrat congressman who says he's considering actually voting for this censure resolution. So it will be interesting to see how Democrats as a whole vote for it, if it does in fact come to the floor for a vote. But right now, that's up to Speaker Johnson whether or not he brings it up to the floor. We're told that it could happen sometime next week. Reporting from Capitol Hill, Melina Weisskopf, NTD News.
The U.S. could still release $6 billion to Iran, even after Iranian-funded terror group Hamas killed over 30 Americans in Israel. NTD's Jack Bradley has more.
The Biden administration is on the brink of giving Iran $6 billion. This is part of a deal in which Iran has released 5 American prisoners. The U.S. says the Americans were unfairly detained. In return, the U.S. has released 5 Iranians and has agreed to transfer $6 billion of Iran's restricted cash from South Korea to Qatar. Iran would then be able to use that money, which it currently cannot.
The Islamic Republic of Iran has spent more than $20 billion to support foreign terror groups in the Middle East. They don't really care about providing for the material needs of the Iranian people. They will always prioritize terror. And the United States should not aid the regime in this effort.
During a congressional hearing, Iran expert Gabriel Naronha said Iran shouldn't be allowed to touch this money, especially after Hamas, which Iran heavily funds, killed over 1,400 people in Israel, including over 30 Americans. The Biden administration stresses that Iran can use the money only for humanitarian purposes, such as buying food and medicine for its people. The U.S. says the Treasury Department will monitor each transaction.
So many times in history when Iran has filed paperwork that's fraudulent, front companies, false transactions that have gone to money laundering, that have gone to the IRGC, gone to Assad in Syria, Hulk Bank in Turkey. Remember that massive scandal still being prosecuted today? That was all based on humanitarian transactions.
During the same hearing, Iran expert Richard Goldberg said that Iran could still use that money for terrorism. Throughout history, Iran has spent billions of dollars meant for humanitarian purposes on terrorism, and it may have access to the $6 billion in Qatar even now.
The Biden administration has mentioned a, quote, quiet understanding with Qatar regarding the $6 billion in Iranian funds exchanged in the hostage deal. What does a quiet understanding look like in practice?
It means nothing at all, because a quiet understanding has no legal basis. It does not legally prevent Qatar from distributing those funds to Iran.
Iran makes most of its money through